introduction really to what we want to talk about today. Um, and the session that we have planned for today really invites us to reflect on justice, power, and ethical reform, and how those really sit at the heart of Islam. And just looking at the example of the Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, he was someone who looked at injustice and took it head on, and he built alternative models that focused on mercy, dignity, and equality. And in a time where we're looking and we're facing racial, sectarian, and systemic divides, we're really looking to ask, what does it mean to be a Muslim change maker in this moment? What does liberation look like as a collective? And what would the cost be of us staying comfortable in such unjust systems? And we are so privileged today to be joined by um, a change maker through and through, who really, when I was looking through the work that Dr. Mashuq has done, I had to select just a few of the experiences because, mashallah, there's just so much. Dr. Mashuq is currently serving as the chair of the governing board for the Bordesley Girls' School and Sixth Form. He's also the director and trustee of the Markfield Institute of Higher Education, as well as being a member of the Sheikh Zayed Board for Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge, and the founder and director of a global trading enterprise in Turkey, which supports humanitarian work for refugees, as well as being a member of the executive board of the Birmingham Commonwealth Chamber. Dr. Mashouk, I think we'll need to get you in for a talk about being a productive Muslim as well, inshallah. And just looking at his experience previously, Dr. Mashouk has served for more than 2 decades as a director for equalities, community cohesion, and community safety at Birmingham City Council, tackling so many issues, but to highlight a few: extremism, racial equality, and interfaith work, and has held distinguished positions in both academia and public service. And that description honestly does fall short of so many of the experiences you've had. But we would love to hear from you about your thoughts on those concepts of justice, power, and ethical reform. Um, so without further ado, Dr. Mashouk, I will hand over to you for your introduction on this, and then we will follow with a Q&A. We will be posting a link where people can ask their questions, and we will have a moderated Q&A and discussion session, inshallah. So, Dr. Mashouk, it's over to you, inshallah.
Jazakallah khairan, sister. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for being with us this evening, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I'd like to kick off with a slight bio, because I've been blessed that the situations I've found myself in over the last 55 years in professional life has been quite exciting, but also work which has enabled me to be very much a person who tries to influence change within society. Just for your information, I was born in Guyana in the northeast of South America, which is considered to be part of the Caribbean. And you might like to know also that that country has the first Muslim president. And I was brought up in London in the late 1950s, and I've therefore had the privilege of witnessing the evolution of the Muslim community in Britain, and also to be engaged with a whole host of activities across the Muslim world. I'd like to say something about how I have been impacted by change. So when I was a student, there were two individuals who actually impacted on my life and actually kind of resulted in me being where I am today. One was a brother called Abdul Wahid Hamid. Some of you may know of him, and some of you may know of him through some of the literature that he produced. And the second was Brother Ibrahim Sir from Malaysia. Brother Abdul Wahid Hamid was from Trinidad. Both these individuals met me at uh, the Central Mosque in London. It wasn't the Central Mosque in those days as it is today. It was just a lodge which was gifted by the monarch to the Muslims, and we were there. And then we were having just a conversation, and they said to me, "Look, we would like you to attend the FOSSIS conference." That was one of the very first FOSSIS conferences. It was held in Britain. And I said, okay. And I asked them, what would I do there and this, that, and the other. And they said that they gave me some explanation about that. And I said, well, how would I get there? They said, don't worry about that. So they bought my ticket. They asked me to get to Euston Station. And then we made our way to Manchester, where the Fosters Conference was being held. And I was so inspired by that weekend that I obviously became involved in FOSSIS, the Muslim magazine as we had at that time. And that was the beginning of my change. And as a young person, I was in fact the youngest person in the group of three. And because of that, I became a novelty amongst everybody. And all the contemporary leaders of the Islamic movements I was able to rub shoulders with. And that really inspired me. The second person who actually had an impact on me and then set me going was Professor Khurshid Ahmed. He attended a FOSSIS conference from Pakistan. He came from Pakistan and he attended a FOSSIS conference. And I was inspired by his interpretation and understanding of Islam. And to such an extent that afterwards, I asked him, well, where are you going next? He said, well, he's going back home and he has to catch the plane next day at London Heathrow. So I just asked him, and I didn't expect him to give this response. I asked him, would you like to come home with me to meet my family and stay overnight, and we'll take you to the airport? Well, with all the other people who were there, I thought he would have said, well, I've already got arrangements. But he said yes. So we went to Tube, and at that time I was living in a place called Walthamstow in East London, and met my family. We had dinner, and then he took me aside and he asked me what my ambitions were. And I told him what my ambitions were. And I said I was very much interested in Islam. I've also gone through hifz of Quran, etc. And he said, okay, I will be coming back to UK to take up my doctoral program. I said, okay, fine. And I'll be living in Leicester. So after a couple of years, he came back and we met up again. And that's when my journey started in terms of change. These three individuals had a profound impact on me. Got involved with FOSSIS, became involved with UKIM, became involved when UKIM, when Bangladesh was created into Dawat al-Islam, Young Muslims, etc., YMO. And through those platforms, we were engaged in a whole set of a range of programs which would enable us to influence many, many people in Britain. And I went to Leicester, took up a part-time job. Then I joined what we now know as the Islamic Foundation. Myself, Professor Khurshid, and Manazir Hassan, we embarked on this program. He was our leader. And as you see, where Islamic Foundation is today, we started in an old garage, knitting factory, and now we have a big campus in Leicester. And this is where my journey in terms of beginning change. So I wanted to give you how those who we associate with impact us in terms of change, and then eventually we become change makers in our own right. change making begins with each one of us. So each one of us have to look inside ourselves to know to what extent we need to embark on a change program. It is interesting when we review the life of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. For him, life in Makkah and Medina were opportunities for influencing and affecting change. However, before he started his mission, there was a period of preparation. His life before he received the first wahi was significant because it was a period of building his reputation and integrity. Can anyone listening in give me 2 examples that demonstrates the Prophet's reputation before he received the first wahi? What was his reputation before he received the first revelation? Can anybody give me 2 examples?
Omar, I think. Go for it.
Yeah, this as we know, sorry, that he was known as a Sadiq and Amin. He was a trustworthy.
Absolutely.
That's one. Also, the Meccans used to give him their valuables as a trust amana, and used to keep for them. So these 2 things I can.
Yeah, so important in change making is our own standing, reputation, and standing in our community. And that trustworthiness, confidence becomes from ethics, akhlaq, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So these are 2 good examples and there are many, many more that I'm sure others could give. We also find that when the Prophet Muhammad received his first wahi, did he keep it to himself? Can anybody respond to that? No, he went out and he shared it with others. Those who were receptive joined his group. This period marks the setting of the ground for individual change. This is relevant to us today because unless we begin the process of tazkiyah, purification of ourselves, which leads to tarbiyah, development, change won't happen and we won't be able to influence others. This means that unless we become the standard bearers of Islam, we cannot hope to inspire and influence others. However, this process of individual change need not occur on our own, but through mutual support of others. This means individual change can be more effective when supported and shared with others and who are like-minded. And that process of change takes place in what we now call a community or a group of people. In my life, I have measured or benchmarked, as far as I can, my actions against the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad. I think for a change maker, it is important to understand an integral relationship with the life of the Prophet Muhammad, because he provides context for change. And the messages that he gave, we can learn and universalize much of that to be able to resolve and to change the situation that we are in. The second source for me is obviously the Sharia. And here I take the Sharia in a broad sense. And what is important to me in relation to the Sharia is the actual mechanism and tools that the Sharia gives for us to become a critical thinker, to become, to be thoughtful, to measure everything that we do and say against certain principles. The first of which is Islamic epistemology. By that I mean, which in everyday language, the source of ilm. And we all know what those are. The Quran, the Wahi, the revelations, particularly the Quran, Risala, prophethood, particularly the Prophet Muhammad, ghaib, things that we don't see, akhirah, all play an important part in the source of knowledge from which drives the actions that we make. This epistemology is really important for us to understand, because the epistemology of Islam fundamentally is about akhlaq, ethics, and it also provides us with the drivers for social change and social justice. And when we look at the Prophet Muhammad's life and subsequently those who have led us, we found that social justice has been a key area, because it is about how we enact our Bismillah. Many of us say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim as though it's a ritual. But if we study this sentence which we say whenever we do something, it has a deep meaning: compassion and mercy. Compassion and mercy. Compassion and mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which we are supposed to reflect in whatever we do. So that epistemology informs the ethics of Islam. How do we interpret those ethics? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet Muhammad has given us those arkan that we all follow. Now, if you speak to any Muslim today, go to any mosque and ask them, why do you perform salah? Why do you come to the masjid? Invariably, they say, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to do that. But okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to do that, but is that the end of it? What is the salah meant to be doing? It's meant to be changing our attitude and behaviors, reminding us all the time of what our responsibilities are and what our obligations are. Unfortunately, we all can see, we see it for ourselves, we witnessed it. The person who goes, we find it, people go to the masjid, they're at the masalla, they behave in a certain way. As soon as they get out of the door of the masjid, another personality is reflected. This is not what Islam wants. We have to be consistent, and salah is meant to help us in that. It's the whole of the salah teaches us so many things about leadership, about management, about discipline, etc. Saum, fasting. We move from the preparation of ourselves to the action. What we must experience of those who don't have, and what we must do to resolve those things. Now, a lot of people talk about charity during Ramadan. I don't like to use the word charity, to be honest. It doesn't fit with my understanding of what giving during Ramadan is about. Giving during Ramadan is about empowering. It's about empowering others to be successful, to be future givers. And there are many aspects which we don't have time to go into around fasting. But a key word for me around fasting is empowerment. And then zakah, again, usually translated as charity. It is not a charity. It's something we do fi sabilillah, for empowering and giving authority to others, giving power to others to change their lives and to become better Muslims, better human beings, etc. And then we have Hajj, which is sacrifice. Again, that teaches us about what are the ethics of Islam and the brotherhood and unity of Islam, and also the sacrifices that we make. So these arkan provide the ethics of our spirit for influencing change. So this framework is important to me, And I think it is important for those who are engaged in change. When I read the Quran and reflect on the Sunnah and the life of the Prophet Muhammad, the Quran actually doesn't give many prescriptions. It fundamentally tells us what the ethics are and what are the important priorities that we should have in our life and how we should influence others. It's the Seerah and the Sunnah which actually gives us the actions and the examples from the life of the Prophet ﷺ through his Sunnah of how we affect change. And that is why, for me, the life of the Prophet ﷺ, together with the Quran, become the benchmark for me as a change maker and how we affect change. Now, we live in a very complex world today. I live in a situation where on the one hand, I'm trying to affect change in the Muslim community, but on the other hand, I'm also trying to affect change in the non-Muslim community. And I would suspect most of us on this program are at that boundary between two cultures, two faiths, two ways of life, two ideologies, etc. And internally, in each of these, there's great complexity. And I think as a change maker, we have to understand the context of each of these. The world in which we live today is very much a world of tyranny, injustices, and as we're now finding, the total absence of human rights. We as Muslims have an important role to play in how to affect change and be leaders in the world in which we live to affect change. I'd like to stop there now because we only have half an hour left and open this for discussion and questions and answers, comments, whatever. And I think the sister will be moderating this.
Inshallah, I'm not sure how I'm going to follow that, Dr. Mashuq. Mashallah, that was such a different lens through which to see not only just the acts of worship, but also how we should be looking at change making. We have a couple of questions on the Slido, but if anybody has a comment that they would like to make, and Sheikh Nuruddin, not to put you on the spot, but if you have anything you would like to add as well before we go to those questions, I'll open the floor now, and if not, I'll turn to the questions. Go for it, Midge.
Firstly, Jazakallah khair for sharing. What an inspirational story. I think my question is, how do you stay hopeful? How do you stay relentless? It'd be hard not to feel the weight of the world.
Because through my journey, I've seen many successes of individuals who have moved on the journey of change, but themselves become change makers. And I think Iman and Taqwa is really important here. And when I talk about Iman, I don't translate Iman as faith. For me, Iman is a body of convictions that we hold to be true. And that is the ilm and the arkan. And then the taqwa is the consciousness of Allah's power and also his authority to help us in change. And that's what makes me optimistic. And the Quran also tells us we should be not pessimistic, but optimistic. And if you, as an individual, think you're trying to do as much as you can to help in effecting change, promoting social justice, the ethics of Islam, or the life by which we need to live, and you're constantly seeing some results, even if it's small, I think that's what makes you positive in the journey.
Jazakallah khair. No, that really helps. Good.
I think we've actually lost, or he's dropped off Sheikh Nuruddin, so we'll turn to a few of the questions on the Slido. So the first kind of topic that people have asked on is how can we reconnect Islamic change making with the concepts of beauty, art, and culture rather than just resistance or scholarship, which can kind of obscure the spiritual heart of justice?
Well, we must start off with that all creation is beautiful, and all that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created is beauty. Art and culture is an essential part of Islamic change making because it inspires others. It's the practical visualization of Allah's creation in whatever form that art and culture comes in. My challenge today is that unfortunately art and culture is not given that importance as it has been in the past, and that whenever we do things practically, um, we kind of reflect the beauty of life. I found that unfortunately we are very repetitive in what we're doing. Also, art and culture has challenged consistently and been an inspiration and driver for change, which we don't sufficiently recognize both historically and contemporaneously. I think one of the problems I also have is the terminologies that we're beginning to use today, which is not very helpful. So I'll give you an example. What do we mean by Muslimness? And some people have defined this in a very narrow way. That then restricts the wide variety of Islamic culture and art that has developed over time. I don't really know what that means. The Quran tells us what it means to be a Muslim. Why do we have to invent another term for this? The other thing which challenges me is that because of nationalism, the growth of nationalism, and its impact on Muslim countries, or what we call Muslim countries, we've got this binary terminology between Muslim and non-Muslim. So what does non-Muslim mean? What does that really mean? I come across a lot of non-Muslims, so-called in inverted commas, who do some very beautiful things. And I've come across Muslims who don't do very good, beautiful things. And so this binary, so this is one of the issues. The second issue is the rise of ethnicity and how ethnicity has actually divided the community instead of bringing the community together. And I think in Britain, we have a very brilliant opportunity to change that situation because, and I think the third generation Muslims are the people who can effect that change because they're not so interested in the ethnic stuff. They're not so interested in, the binary language that we use. They want to be good, productive, successful Muslims in an environment which they have chosen to live. And how can they impact and influence those to come to the same journey and the same deen? Sorry, that was a very long-winded way of.
Not at all. That was full of gems, honestly, mashallah. And we have a question that actually links to that last point that you were just talking about, which is what do younger change makers need to understand about the struggles of first generation Muslim leadership and vice versa? So I guess they're asking what can they both learn from each other to affect that change making that you're talking about?
I think that's a really good question because I had the privilege of going through that period. So I saw what the Muslim community was like in 1950s, which was very embryonic. In those days, we had no halal shops. We didn't have all the paraphernalia that we now consider to be part of our community. We had to interact with people of different faiths and non-faith. We had to suffer Islamophobia in a much harsher environment than young people have today. And I think those stories are important.
Mm.
It's interesting that we are looking at establishing an Islamic Heritage Center, which captures that history, that post-war history, as well as the contemporary history, so that young Muslims are better informed about what was the journey of what we call the first generation and what changes have occurred over that time. I mean, I'll give you a good example. I remember the time when in London, where I was growing up, we had no halal meat shops.
Yeah.
So where were we getting our meat from? We got it from the Jewish community. We got kosher meat
Yeah.
from what is now called Whitechapel,
Mm.
Petticoat Lane, which was predominantly run by the Jewish community. My father happened to be the first, he was a GP, but he's a very strict Muslim, as we would expect. He established the first halal meat shop in Hessel Street, not far from Commercial Road, where we have the mosque. And when we moved to Walthamstow, that shop used to supply halal meat. And then we ran a kind of delivery service to all the Muslims in Walthamstow, which wasn't very large numbers. So they would get their halal meat. So these kind of examples need to be known to young people. In the factories in London, London Rubber Company is a very good example, and not Circular Road. I don't know whether it exists anymore. Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus had to work together.
Yeah. Yeah.
They shared their experiences of each other. The kind of tensions that we have now did not exist because it was a question of survival of everyone. And some of those Sikhs and Hindus became Muslims because of that interaction. And I think that history is important for young change makers today to be aware of, that there is a prehistory to their existence. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, just speaking about Whitechapel and Walthamstow, imagine, for example, Whitechapel as a predominantly Jewish area is
Yeah,
compared to it's now, which is, almost 90% Muslim and, a few city workers here and there. That's crazy. And I guess the converse question, which was asked as well, is what do you think the first generation or even the second generation of change makers can take from the younger second and third and fourth generation of Muslims now? What's our value add, I guess, is the question.
I think what's important here is that many of the Muslims who came after the war came from very poor, disadvantaged areas of the Muslim world, rural areas, farming areas. Their opportunities of the education which we have benefited from, they didn't have.
Yeah.
An important aspect of their Islam was based on oral tradition and dependence on Maulanas and Imams, etc. The advantage we have today, and maybe we have too much of it to a certain degree, is we've had the benefit of an education, a literacy. We have a higher literacy level than they had. And by the way, I'm not being critical. That's not their fault. It's the circumstances in which they lived. We therefore have the opportunity of knowing our Islam from the sources. There are some of us who are lazy and we go to Google Imam to get what we want. But Islam, from my understanding, teaches us, and this was the first the Prophet Muhammad received, was to read. In other words, we have an obligation as an individual to acquire the knowledge as an individual to become a change maker. And I think that's something that we can say we can benefit from. Now, I have to say that a lot of young Muslims, alhamdulillah, are playing that role. But I think young Muslims still feel that they lack the leadership to pull it together and to pull the community together so that we can be effective change makers.
Yeah.
And to do that, I think I mean, I have always lived my life as a Muslim, not as a Guyanese, not British, as a Muslim who lives in Britain. That is one of the issues that I have today, that as a change maker, we need to bring the universality of Islam much more as a priority than we have in the past. And being a Muslim is much more important than anything else. And then what does that mean to be a Muslim? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us very clearly what that is in the Quran. And we are meant to be ambassadors, and we have a role to play through dawah. And I take dawah in a broad context. And I think that dawah is about how we influence the society we live. It's not fulfilling, such as promoting social justice, promoting human rights, promoting the values that make us a good human being, as well as a good Muslim.
SubhanAllah, yeah, a lot to think about. And I swear we didn't actually plan this, but the next question that I feel leads really well on is kind of talking about what you've just spoken about, but is the concept of, are we prioritizing the Ummah over tackling some of the issues that actually we have? And you touched on this before as well, but that we have these issues within our own spaces of racism, classism, misogyny, theological elitism, all of this stuff within our own spaces. Should we be, so I guess, yeah, the question is asking, should we be prioritizing the Ummah and this unity, this concept of being a Muslim, or should we be tackling racism, or what does the balance look like, I guess?
I think this is really something to my heart, because I've been struggling with this for a long time. If we adhere to the Quran and Sunnah of what it means to be a Muslim, then we begin to tackle some of the issues within our Ummah. So you take the situation in Britain. The community is basically based on ethnic boundaries. Even the masjid has grown up. So you have people talking about the Bengali mosque, the Pakistani mosque, the Mirpuri mosque, the Arab mosque. Where does this language come from?
Yeah, it's crazy.
And now I go to all the mosques. I'm not interested in whether it's Bengali, Pakistani, or Arab, because actually they're all performing what I require as a good Muslim. This is an important challenge to us. We have, as change makers, to change that. We use the new environment to actually affect that change, that these kinds of divisions should not exist. Then we look at the theological differences. Young Muslims are not interested in those theological interests. I mean, this is my understanding. They're not interested in those divisions. They want to know, what is Islam?
Yeah.
How can they be a good Muslim? And how could they how could they influence the environment? So these little battles that are going on between theological groups have no real meaning to the young Muslim, and it has no real purpose to the future of Islam, either in Britain or in other parts of the world. Then the issue about Islamophobia. I do not agree with the definition, to be honest.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I do not agree with the definition. So in the time of Prophet Muhammad, where he and the Sahaba were being tortured, that was Islamophobia in the context of how we understand it. Did they call it Islamophobia? First of all, as a change maker, we have to understand there's going to be a reaction. That reaction can have degrees of harshness or degrees of acceptance. And I think the problem I have with that terminology, it excludes a whole group of other people.
Okay, yeah.
It excludes, so a white revert, me from Guyana, feel excluded from that definition, to be honest. It's very much an Asian-oriented definition,
Yeah.
but it's also a definition which has been shaped not just by Muslims, but by non-Muslims. Their interest, it's in their interest to have that terminology around. There's no doubt Muslims are suffering, Muslims are facing racism, Muslims are facing identity challenges, Muslim women in particular who wear hijab suffer. But how do we deal with that? And our failure is we're not very good at explaining Islam to the communities that we are engaged with.
Yeah.
We're really good at that. So, and we don't challenge it sometimes. So, for instance, I come from that generation where it was bandied around Islamic fundamentalism. Muslims wanted to use this language, but they never challenged it. And those who did were not sufficient enough to be listened to. And we kind of adopt certain forms of communication, which actually works against us. So I think we do have a role to play in ensuring the right understanding of Islam is actually being promoted. And then we will reduce some of the tensions. So amongst our lawyers in Britain, Muslim lawyers, how many of them really understand British law in relation to Islamic law? And by so doing, where they can identify the areas of agreement and the areas of disagreement. And I find in my daily activity, there are many areas where I can agree with. I don't see much conflict between British law and Islamic law, but then there are other areas which I do. Now, my role, therefore, is how do I make that change? How do I affect change? And this is, and you can apply this to medicine, you can apply this to engineers when they build buildings and design buildings. Do Muslims who are professionals in these areas take into account the backdrop of their Islamic commitments?
Yeah, subhanAllah. That I'm actually a lawyer as well, so that definitely applies, and just everything within that advice is so relevant. Just actually thinking about the definitions that we're having and the way that we're having those conversations, rather than also just focusing on, the impacts of these conversations, is such a new way to look at it, at least for me, and I'm sure for the audience. We will take one last question. And it's an interesting one to end on. But the question is, how do we cultivate or prioritize the concept of ikhlas, so sincerity, whilst engaging in political or social work that often rewards ego/visibility?
Well, I've been asked so many times, and I'm sure a lot of other Muslims have, asked to join political parties. Fortunately, I've decided not to, because I think I'm more effective outside. The minute you join a political party, you've got to compromise. And that compromise can work against myself as a Muslim, but it can also work against my community as well. And whilst we do have to take the battles internally, and you have to be very clear about why you're there, I think for me at the moment, I've yet to see the ikhlas being reflected in the political arena, both in Britain and in the Muslim world. I think how it doesn't underpin, it is not underpinned by the ethics that Islam expects of an individual Muslim. And I've seen many Muslims who are, some of them are my friends, who are in political parties, but when their issues come up, so I give an example. When I think it was the Conservatives, I can't remember which party it was, wanted to provide, when there was the question of providing free school meals, free milk and free school meals, particularly in those areas that were less advantaged. And there were Muslims who actually voted against it.
Yeah.
And you, as a Muslim, and the reason why they voted against it, they're following the party line.
Yeah.
And Islam talks about what we should be doing for the miskin and the yatim. And that's how political parties' ideology does impact on us and therefore undermines our sincerity, our ikhlas. The Prophet Muhammad succeeded because of his sincerity. Sincerity underpinned his integrity. And we as Muslims have to retrieve back our integrity if we want to effect change.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And for those change makers who are looking to potentially go into, whether it's a political arena or a social arena, and as a last piece of advice, maybe, what would be your kind of main piece of advice for them to, when they are looking at structures that they're resisting, for example, structures of injustice and the like, how to go forward as a change maker and maintain that sincerity, that ikhlas, and not let those systems of oppression, all the stuff you were talking about, political neutrality and these things, to dampen that sincerity or ikhlas, if you have one takeaway or one major piece of advice.
I think you have to be true to yourself as a Muslim, and you have to reflect upon what your standards are. I have actually been invited to join Muslim charities. I'm not going to name any of them. One of them was to do with domestic violence. But then when I got into it, and they wanted me to be the chair, I realized it was more to do with getting funding, not about addressing the issue of domestic violence. And I said, I'm sorry, can't continue, because that's not what I'm here for. Yeah, we do need, but that can't be more important than actually serving the people who are suffering. And I think that we have to be true to ourselves if we want to succeed. And we will succeed, inshallah.
Inshallah, inshallah. Such a powerful take-home message of staying true to yourself, which requires such a level of knowing yourself and feeds into
Yeah.
so much of the stuff you were talking about, the community that surrounds you and that being a basis on which you make this change. And essentially, you've set out such an incredible roadmap for a change maker. I personally wish that we could continue talking. This has been such an insightful conversation. Jazakallah khair for your time, for your insight. And inshallah, we will invite you for much more conversations. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone. This has been so insightful. Jazakallah khair to all of you guys for joining, for tuning in, for your wonderful questions. We will catch up with you again next week. We will publish the details of next week's session in the next few days. Jazakallah khair for joining. And if you have any reflections from this session that you want to pass on to us or that you want to pass on to Dr. Mashuq, please let us know. Thank you so much, guys, for joining. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum.